Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the troubling story of how America's biggest bank got tangled up with one of its most infamous sex offenders. We're going to be looking at this incredible investigation from the New York Times, which really peeled back the curtain on a disturbing partnership. And what it uncovered is a story that shows you just how power and money can build this impenetrable shield for truly awful criminal activity.
So get this. For 15 years, all the way from the late 90s to 2013, JPMorgan processed over $1 billion for Jeffrey Epstein. And look, this wasn't just a few big deals. No, we are talking about more than 4,700 separate transactions, including, unbelievably, payments that went straight to the victims of his sex trafficking ring.
So that's the billion-dollar question, right? How could one of the most sophisticated banks on the planet, with all its fancy compliance systems, not only bank a convicted sex offender, but basically help facilitate his criminal empire? Let's unpack the evidence, because it tells a pretty clear story.
To really get why this happened, you have to understand that this wasn't your typical banker-client setup. Not at all. It was, for lack of a better word, symbiotic. Both Epstein and some very important people at the bank were getting a whole lot out of keeping this relationship going.
So what did each side get out of this deal? Well, for Epstein, JPMorgan gave him two things he desperately needed. First, unlimited access to the global financial system so he could fund his crimes. And second, maybe even more important, it gave him the veneer of legitimacy. You know, being a client of a firm like that makes you look respectable. And for JPMorgan, they got a very rich client and, crucially, access to his incredible network of powerful people.
See, Epstein wasn't just some guy with a lot of money. He was a master connector. He was like a human Rolodex, introducing the bank's top brass to absolute titans, people like Google co-founder Sergey Brin, world leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu. So, to some of the most powerful people at the bank, he wasn't just a client, he was an indispensable partner.
But to hang on to a client this valuable, the bank had to do more than just cash his checks. They had to actively ignore, well, a mountain of warning signs.
Now, you got to understand, banks are legally required to be on the lookout for red flags. These are really well-known warning signs of potential crime. I mean, they train their people to spot this stuff and report it immediately.
And Epstein's accounts, they were a walking, talking textbook of red flags. I'm talking massive, regular cash withdrawals, tens of thousands of dollars, month after month. You had suspicious wire transfers going out to people in Eastern Europe and Russia. These are classic, flashing light indicators of trafficking and money laundering.
And here's the absolute kicker. This wasn't a case of things slipping through the cracks. Oh no. The internal compliance teams at JPMorgan, they saw these red flags. They raised alarms over and over again. But every single time they were shut down by senior executives who wanted Epstein to stay a client.
And check this out, because this right here shows you the crazy double standard they were operating under. Back in 2006, the actor Wesley Snipes was just accused of tax fraud. JPMorgan dropped him as a client almost overnight. But in that same time frame, when Jeffrey Epstein was arrested for sex crimes, the bank actually held a meeting and decided to keep him. No real restrictions, nothing.
So who was making these calls? Who were the people so dead set on protecting a client that was setting off every single alarm bell in the building?
Well, right at the center of this whole web was a man named Jess Staley. He was a top executive, at one point even considered a frontrunner for CEO. And his relationship with Epstein was described as long, multifaceted, and intimate. It went way, way beyond a typical banker-client thing.
I mean, just look at what he did. Staley personally went to visit Epstein in jail back in 2008. He made trips to Epstein's different properties. And back at the bank, he was Epstein's #1 defender, constantly shutting down the compliance officers who were screaming that this guy needed to be dropped.
Which, of course, brings us to maybe the biggest question in this whole mess. What did the guy at the absolute top, CEO Jamie Dimon, actually know? Dimon is famous for being a hands-on CEO, a micromanager who knows every detail of his bank. And yet he claims he had no idea who Epstein was until his arrest in 2019.
And the lawyer for Epstein's victims, David Boies, he put it perfectly. He said, look, it's a binary choice. Either Jamie Dimon knew about Jeffrey Epstein and has been lying this whole time, or he really didn't know and was somehow completely out of the loop on this massive, toxic client. And as Boies said, neither one of those looks good for the CEO of the biggest bank in America.
Okay, so after all of this came out, what actually happened to the bank?
What was the price JPMorgan ultimately had to pay?
In 2023, the bank paid out a total of $365 million to settle lawsuits. That breaks down to $290 million for Epstein's victims and another $75 million for the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is where a lot of his crimes happened.
Now, don't get me wrong, $365 million is a staggering amount of money for you or me. But for a bank the size of JPMorgan, well, you really need some perspective. Let's put that number up against what the bank actually makes. In 2023, the very same year they paid these settlements, JPMorgan made a profit of $50 billion. That means the total penalty, all $365 million of it, added up to less than 1% of their profit. For a single year, for a company that massive, this was effectively a rounding error, just the cost of doing business.
And that's the question we're left with, isn't it? If a fine of this size is just a minor inconvenience, little more than a rounding error on a balance sheet, then what does real accountability even look like for a corporation that enables crimes this horrific?